It won't surprise you that we are on the hard remain side, and we still have plenty of grievances. But going into the book, none of us ever imagined that this would go well. But was there a point where we can kind of pinpoint that we lost the chance for an even sort of a minimally damaging Brexit?
It's a good question. You could argue, that Brexit was always binary. It was conceived in political enmity. It was never going to be, a vote to leave 52-48, and then there was going to be a great national conference, which is what there should have been, and all the industry and representatives were going to get in a nice big tent and sit down and work out a median. I don't think it was probably ever going to happen. And because the way the EU negotiates, where you've got 27 other member states with competing interests, the way they protected themselves from their own internal squabbles, right, was to take a very hard line with the UK. Right, that's the way they preserve their own unity. So once you plug those two things into the equation, it was always going to be quite binary and a quite hard break. Yeah. There maybe was a moment, and I don't want to overstate this, where Theresa May's deal, if it had been backed by Labour, which was essentially the single market for goods, might. And I got in a lot of trouble on Twitter and other places for saying a plague on both their houses. Maximalist Remainers, who thought Theresa May's deal was a super hard Brexit. Well, look at what you could have won. And maximalist Leavers who wanted, a no deal Brexit. Actually, the extreme wings in the end just crushed the centre. But actually, maybe there was a moment. I don't know whether politically that deal could have survived. She spent far too long getting there. She spent far too long being utterly unrealistic about what her options were. I don't think her civil servants helped her in indulging her in a load of fantasies that were about, remember, checkers. That was about squaring differences in the UK cabinet, not about delivering what was negotiable in Brussels. So maybe there was a moment for single market for goods. Maybe that's where we'll end up in the fullness of time. I don't know. There'll be a lot of cost in the interim. But if you really want me to, I think it was probably always going to be messy.
We talk about how the Conservative Party has kind of turned on its head and been dragged to the right quite a lot in this podcast, and everyone politically can discuss that. But when we look at the moment around fuck business, for example, was that perhaps a more fundamental shift than we gave it credit for when it came to Conservative ideology? Because it seems like such a strange thing for a Conservative, the party of business, to say. And even though now we're seeing the real dog ends of this rightward shift and this change from the rooting of Conservative values, whatever they ever were, but was actually a lot more momentous than we gave it credit for at the time.
I think because people in this country don't really understand business, and because business, the voices of people who move things and make things and actually pay people's wages, are pretty unrepresented in the political discussion. It's amazing how few politicians actually bother to talk to or understand the mechanics of what happens. You ended up in a world where people didn't understand quite how extraordinary it was that Johnson should say fuck business, and what the subtext of that was, right? And what the subtext of that was that for years, Boris Johnson and his cohorts, going back to Bendy Bananas, had peddled a narrative that they were shackled to a corpse, that single market membership was going to make us poorer and was sclerotic and was strangling the country, and that we would be more virile and freer and better off by leaving. And there was never a really very cogent economic or business case for that being the case. And so what fuck business was really a kind of expression of frustration when that narrative came slap bang up against reality. I mean, they continued with it and have continued with it for a long time. Jacob Rees-Mogg, the retained EU law bill, asking readers of The Sun to write in and say which EU directives they want to get rid of. Even now, right now, Kemi Badenoch is running a consultation about regulation that is still about deregulation, about getting rid of regulation, whereas actually regulation is both a burden for business, but it's also an enabler for business. It's what allows you to trade seamlessly with other jurisdictions.
That's such an important point, because he was making a speech today before we recorded Wednesday. And, because I was covering both, it was such a sort of a weird juxtaposition to see in one courtroom this discussion about how we didn't do risk assessment properly, how we didn't do contingency preparedness properly. And then in another room, Kemi Badenoch saying, we need to be more gung-ho. Enough of this safety first and risk assessment stuff. And it was just so strange to me because it's a fundamental misunderstanding of business. Like, entrepreneurship thrives within certainty of rules. Proper risk assessment and contingency planning is what allows you to take risks.
Yeah.
Without it, you're just a fucking gambler. You might as well go to a casino.